Okay, great. I'm a judge in Brooklyn, and first I'd like to thank His Holiness and the Pontifical Academy for having us here today. When I first started as a judge, I was most afraid that I would have to have the answers to all the questions. And after many years as a judge, I now realize the job is much harder than I thought. I need to know the questions to ask. And that's why I'm glad we're all here and you've all helped me understand some of those questions. I want to focus today on a contradiction in the life of a judge, and that is that despite all of our attempts to have as broad a life experience as possible, we are all prisoners of who we are, ourselves. We have the life experience of, most likely, educated, professional people who are successful, who live in nice places, and who are very different from many of the people we see in our work. How do we overcome that? And how do we understand people who are different from us? This is an inherent conflict, and as one of our famous judges in the United States, Learned Hand, once said, there is no such thing as truth in the law. The best we can do is try to approximate it, become as dispassionate and impartial as possible, and transcend our own personal backgrounds to understand others. So I want to focus on people who are invisible, unseen, and unheard. I'm going to show photographs of them in the background. But first I'm going to start with some general concepts. I believe you'll recognize who they are at some point. They're people who you may have seen at one point, you may not, depending on your life experience. I think I'm going to need help doing this. It's the bottom one? Okay. It's not working. Okay. All right. Yeah, could you possibly do them for me every 10 seconds? Great. All right, I have an assistant. We live in a world filled with images of violence and social unrest. We can't turn on the television or open a newspaper or go online without seeing the effects of war, terrorism, mass incarceration, climate change, and growing economic inequality throughout the world. We see them instantaneously and repeatedly, yet many victims of social inequality are isolated and invisible to most of us. Despite legal protections, they face discrimination, loss of liberty, segregation, poverty, and abuse. For many, the courts are the only means of enforcing laws designed to protect them, but the road to the courthouse can be long and filled with barriers. I would like to discuss briefly what we as neutral and impartial judges may be able to do to help overcome some of these barriers and focus on one class of people for whom these barriers often seem insurmountable. You can probably leave it a little longer. Oh, it's going? Okay, great. These are children and adults with mental disabilities confined in orphanages, and you're seeing photographs of orphanages from around the world and mental institutions. Many of them are places where even their own families aren't allowed to see them. These people are denied the right to an appropriate education in many cases, to work, to housing, to medical care, to treatment in violation of basic principles of international human rights law. Because these facilities are typically closed to the public, most of us are unaware of the conditions inside and the toll that institutionalization takes on the people inside them. And because many of the inmates of these institutions spend much of their lives inside, they are and will remain invisible to us. Perhaps the first and most important question for judges, and I don't think judges in this room, but I think judges outside this room, is whether there is room for the courts to be heard on issues of basic human rights, such as the 3 T's, which the Holy Father discussed in his invitation to this summit. Can courts do this without compromising their neutrality or inappropriately straying into the political arena? There is a fine distinction between advocacy for political, cultural, economic, and social causes and dispensing justice. While a judge should avoid partisan politics and alliances with economic or social interest groups, enforcing the law impartially is a basic judicial function. Being a judge is the pinnacle of human rights. It is a court's duty to apply the law and to ensure that all people have equal access to justice. At the heart of this duty is the application of neutral principles of law and the elimination of barriers to meaningful access to the courts. In so doing, courts give voice to the voiceless and cast light on the invisible. These barriers often include what you've already heard about today: the lack of resources to hire counsel in civil and criminal cases, to initiate and sustain a civil lawsuit, the high cost of litigation, and in many cases, the lengthy delays caused by extensive backlogs due to crushing dockets. Denial of meaningful access to the courts can affect a wide array of civil rights, including the individual's rights to live freely in society, to obtain work in a safe and non-discriminatory workplace, and to adequate shelter. The increasing impact of natural disasters caused by climate change and human error will place greater stress on the legal system in the years to come. Following hurricanes and other extreme weather, we have already begun to see sudden influxes of emergency claims against government agencies and private insurance companies by storm victims in my court, who became homeless and jobless for extended periods of time. These claims can overwhelm already burdened courts, which have difficulty providing timely assistance. I don't have time here today to discuss how we can speed up our dockets and provide better access to the courts. I think a number of speakers have already addressed that. But one measure that I think can be used, if used properly, is a court-annexed dispute resolution system, such as a mediation, that offers litigants conciliation programs in a fair, expeditious, voluntary, and less costly way to resolve their disputes. One of the previous speakers mentioned that there was a concern that people might be denied access to court if they were forced to go to mediation programs. That's a question I think each court has to answer, but I know for our court and most courts in the United States, it is guaranteed greater access to the courts, faster access, and more control over the outcome of the litigation, that litigants in mediation have the choice of a solution, not one that's imposed on them, but one that they can voluntarily choose. As a young lawyer, I was sent to inspect a place called the Willowbrook State School in New York City. I was shocked at what I saw. With a population of 5,430 children and adults, Willowbrook was said to be the largest institution for people with mental disabilities in the world. Overcrowded and understaffed, Willowbrook provided little treatment and offered virtually no educational or recreational activities. And by the way, every person you're seeing here is someone who's either in an institution or in an orphanage, and they're all people like us. At its best, the care was custodial. At its worst, it was deadly. After a visit years before I was there, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of President John Kennedy, called Willowbrook a reproach to us all. And he described the wards as less comfortable and cheerful than the cages in which we put animals. That same year, a man and a boy were scalded, burned to death in a shower. In separate incidents, 3 months apart, a 12-year-old boy strangled to death on an improperly positioned restraint. And a man was killed when another inmate, who was not properly supervised, punched him in the throat. The stench of bodily waste was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I almost threw up the first time I went into the institution. Violence was endemic, by staff against residents and residents against each other. One resident's nose was bitten off. Another lost an ear because of lack of supervision and inadequate treatment. Residents were secluded, restrained, and medicated for the convenience of staff. They sat on wards most of the day, and I think you see pictures of some people sleeping on the wards, with nothing to do because they were overly medicated. Many were naked or poorly clothed, even when I was there. Segregated from their communities, the public was largely unaware they even existed. They were invisible to the world. They had no voice to describe the horrors they suffered. The doors were locked, and family members were rarely permitted on the wards to witness conditions there. Only a lawsuit, court judgments, and the unwavering attention of a federal judge succeeded in closing the institution and placing the residents of Willowbrook in community alternatives. The road to the courthouse was long and slow, but it was the only way. The political system had failed them. Although Willowbrook was closed, there are still many Willowbrooks around the world. The photographs you've been watching show children and adults languishing in overcrowded and understaffed orphanages and institutions in Europe and Africa. They're poorly clothed. Some of them you saw are tied to chairs. The institutionalization these exposés have revealed similar abuses in countries in the Americas, such as Mexico and Guatemala. The institutionalization of people with mental disabilities affects people of all ages, but it has a devastating effect on children, many of whom could live in families with the proper supports. When orphanages are closed, children with disabilities are frequently left behind, transferred to other institutions, while children without disabilities are placed in the community. And these children with disabilities end up spending the rest of their lives in institutions. I want to read you what there's a man named Robert Martin, who is an independent expert on the United Nations Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities. He wrote a prologue to a report by an advocacy group called Mental Disability Advocacy Center. It was a report on Bulgaria. I want to read you his voice to tell you what it's like to be in an institution. Here's what he says. I often wondered why I ended up in the places I did just because I was born with a disability. I was put in a large institution when I was just a baby. I was put in lots of different institutions. I wanted to be loved. I cried to my family. I wanted them to take me home, but they did not come and take me away from the institutions. So in the end, I gave up crying for them. I didn't get any love at the institutions. My life in institutions meant I personally had nothing and no one to call my own. I adopted cats and made them my friends, but then I was moved and I lost that friend. Children raised in institutions learn that good times don't last, and people and pets come and go. The result of this is very negative. We can struggle with how to relate to people. I have lived in places where there was no privacy and nothing to do. People stayed in their pajamas all day, rocking backwards and forth. We were not given our own clothes, but had to share a pool of clothes and grab what we could get. We were even color-coded in groups and had stars and labels and categories. We all had the same haircuts on the same day. We were not treated as individuals. In fact, people said we all looked the same. There was violence, neglect, and abuse everywhere you looked. People were hosed down instead of showered. They were left in their dirty clothes. They were put in isolation. Seeing and having to deal with abuse was really hard. No person should have to live like that. I learned not to trust people and to just try and survive as best I could. I became defensive and on guard all the time. The violence and abuse that was happening around us also taught us that it was okay to behave like that. We got in trouble for our behavior, but the staff didn't. Behind closed doors, the human rights of others are often violated. Living in an institution taught me that I was a nobody, that my life didn't really matter. The World Health Organization estimated in a report in October 2018 that 1 in 4 people in the world will be affected by mental or neurological disorders. They said that the poor often bear the greater burden of mental disorders, both in terms of the risk in having a mental disorder and the lack of access to treatment. Constant exposure, the report said, to severely stressful events, dangerous living conditions, exploitation, and poor health in general all contribute to the greater vulnerability of the poor. Large institutions, it found, no longer represent the best option for patients or families. Such institutions lead to a loss of social skills, excessive restriction, human rights violations, dependency, and reduced opportunities for rehabilitation. The Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities provides for, in Article 19, for the right of people with disabilities to live in the community with choices equal to others. The general comment number 5 of the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities said that for children, the core of the right to be included in the community entails a right to grow up in a family. Large or small group homes are especially dangerous for children for whom there is no substitute for the need to grow up with a family. Family-like institutions are still institutions and are no substitute for care by a family. So I'd like to end by urging that not only do we close institutions, which is phase one of the end of that abuse, but that orphanages and small group homes, which are institutional-like, not be seen as the next stage. And unfortunately, many well-meaning groups, including Caritas, believe that group homes are the solution. They're not. Greater support for families is where we should be headed. Thank you.